Okay, so the last part of our globalization lecture. So we're gonna be talking about neoliberalism in South Africa. So globalization refers to the increasing interconnectedness, integration, and interdependence of countries and societies around the world through various aspects such as economic, political, technological, cultural, and social exchange. It is driven by advancement in communication, transportation, and technology, which have significantly reduced barriers to the movement of goods, services, capital, information, and people across national borders. It is important to note that globalization has had both a negative and positive impact. While it has the potential to promote economic growth, innovation, and cultural diversity, it can also lead to economic inequality, job displacement, and environmental challenges, and the erosion of local cultures and traditions. The effects of globalization can vary across different countries and individuals, and the ongoing debates surrounding its consequences continue to shape global economic and political discussions. Neoliberalism is an economic and political ideology that emerged in the 20th century. It advocates for the promotion of free markets, limited government intervention, and individual liberty as the foundation for economic and social policy. So neoliberalism emphasizes the importance of market forces, privatization, deregulation, and globalization to drive economic growth and development. So here are some key principles and characteristics associated with neoliberalism. So it's free market economics. Neoliberalism places a strong emphasis on free market principles where the forces of supply and demand determine prices, allocate resources, and drive economic activity. So it advocates for minimizing government intervention in the economy, including reducing regulations and trade barriers. And then there's privatization. Neoliberalism promotes the transfer of state-owned enterprises and services into private hands. So this includes privatizing industries such as utilities, transportation, and healthcare, with the belief that private ownership and competition will lead to greater efficiency and improved service delivery. Then there's deregulation. So neoliberalism calls for reducing government regulations and barriers to entry in order to foster competition and innovation. So it argues that excessive regulation hinders market efficiency and economic growth. Then there is fiscal discipline. So neoliberalism emphasizes the importance of fiscal responsibility. So this means it's advocating for balanced budgets, low inflation, and prudent monetary policies. So it often prioritizes reducing public debt and deficits through austerity measures. Then there's globalization. Neoliberalism promotes the liberalization of trade and investment, aiming to remove barriers to international economic integration. So this means it supports the free flow of goods and services and capital across national borders, often through the negotiation of trade agreements and the reduction of tariffs and quotas. Then there's individualism and personal responsibility. So neoliberalism places a strong emphasis on individual liberty, personal responsibility, and self-reliance. So it values the idea that individuals should have the freedom to make their own economic choices and take responsibility for their own outcomes. And then there's limited government intervention. So neoliberalism argues for a reduced role of the state in economic and social affairs, while it recognizes the importance of some government functions, such as protecting property rights and enforcing contracts. So it generally advocates for limited government intervention in the economy. So now it's important to note that neoliberalism has been subject to criticism and debate. Critics argue that it can exacerbate economic inequality, so weakens labor rights and social safety nets, and prioritize market interests over social welfare. So the impact of neoliberal policies can vary across different countries and contexts, and the terms have been interpreted and implemented in various ways by different government institutions. So now, capitalism is an economic and social system characterized by private ownership of the means of production, where individuals rather than the state or the collective own and control the production and distribution of goods and services. It is based on the principles of free market competition, profit motive, and voluntary exchange. Okay, okay, we've gone through this slide. Okay. So we're on slide 6. So the neoliberal world. So origins of neoliberalism. So we can trace the origins of neoliberalism when we study the work of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who were funded by corporations, think tanks. So they argued that a powerful state will erode individual freedoms. So now, neoliberalism as a theory. So representative theorists Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman note they would consider themselves as neoclassical economists or libertarians. So they were major influences in neoclassical economics. They viewed the market as natural and in need of protection by a strong rule of law, but also needing a minimalist but effective state. So the reason they argued for a minimalist state was because they believed the state intervention distorted market incentives and usually makes social outcomes worse. So they believe state failure and rent seeking by the state is a bigger problem than the market failure. And so they argued that most states should be rolled back with many of their functions replaced by markets. Now, looking at theory, prescription, and practice. So, understanding the difference between neoliberalism as theory, prescription, and practice helps us unlock the current debate. So, neoliberals argue that the reforms, um, disappointing results have more to do with incomplete or distorted implementation of the policies, and that the policies and the theory behind them are fundamentally sound. So critics argue that the last 3 decades of reform show that both the theory and the prescription have been tried and have been shown to be inadequate. So there are now many critics in the advanced capitalist countries who attack neoliberalism for undermining national cohesion. So what are the main neoliberal policies? So it's fiscal discipline, cutting state spending and debt, economic liberalization, reducing control over the movement of goods and money, remove protections, which is free trade and flexibility around labor laws and wages, reduced and changed taxation, less tax on rich and business, and more general tax VAT. Okay, so neoliberalism take on society. So citizens are best understood as consumers. Inequality in neoliberalism is actually something that is natural and not something to solve. So wealth is a reward for hardworking people. It's a reward for merit. If you are rich, you deserve it. No idea of inequalities. Okay, so if you're rich, it says you deserve it. So then what is not in the market should be in the market. So imagine the privatization of everything, including things like water. So essentially, this changes the role of the state. Um, selling off state assets, and privatization. So now that we understand what neoliberalism is, let's explain the neoliberal framework in South Africa and relocate our theory talk into our history. Okay. So the politics of neoliberal reform. So neoliberalism emerges 1970s and 1980s, and the massive catalysts were Margaret Thatcher in Britain and President Ronald Reagan in the USA. So Thatcher and Reagan worked with the IMF to force privatization and deregulation across the globe. They did all they could to destroy labor militancy, and because the IMF is involved, the biggest ingredient of neoliberalism was the use of third world countries. So the IMF would borrow money to third world countries, Latin America, Africa, India, then move to bail out third world countries with serious strings attached to their money. So globally, we start to see labor grow militant, organized with strong unions in the 1970s. This evolved with time, especially ignited by the 1970s crisis of overaccumulation. Capital was faced with the what now question, what next? So the World Bank and IMF began to take an active role, and by 1979, we had the World Bank's first structural adjustment program, 1979. So the IMF and the World Bank promote economic liberalization by attaching conditions to new lending. The region most directly affected were Latin America, followed by sub-Saharan Africa. So the World Bank's first structural adjustment program was implemented in 1979. Structural adjustment program was policy packages designed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to address economic challenges faced by developing countries. So the primary objective of these programs was to promote economic stability, growth, and development through a set of policy reforms. So the first SAP was introduced in response to economic difficulties faced by countries in sub-Saharan Africa during the 1970s. These challenges included high levels of external debt, fiscal imbalances, declining commodity prices, and inefficient and unsustainable economic policies. Okay. So the key elements of the World Bank's first structural adjustment program were the implementation and the outcomes of the first SAP varied across countries. While some countries experienced initial stabilization and economic improvements, others faced significant challenges, including social unrest, increased poverty, rising inequality. Critics of the SAPs argued that they prioritized market-oriented reforms without sufficient consideration for social and environmental consequences, leading to adverse impacts on the vulnerable groups, of course. So now, changing the role of the state into the private sector. So we have privatization, meant selling part of the state to private sector. Then we have corporatization, commercialization, run parts of the state as a business for profit, like SAAA. There's flexible labor markets. This meant less regulation and more wage moderation, linking wage increases to productivity, more work, more money. The neoliberalism does not abolish the state, and international institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, promote neoliberal policies and frameworks. So now looking at South Africa and neoliberalism. So now after the day of demonstrations against the past laws, a crowd of about 5,000 to 7,000 Black African protesters went to the police station. The police opened fire on a crowd, killing 69 people, hundreds were injured. The following week saw demonstrations, protests, marches, strikes, riots around the country. On the 30th of March 1960, the government declared a state of emergency, detaining more than 18,000 people. Since then, subsequent capital leaves the country. Overseas investment opportunities were restricted for South African conglomerates. There's international sanctions. 1980s there's the South African economic recession. So the world went through structural transformation, attempts of global capital to renew capital accumulation by reasserting control over labor markets and the labor process to regain control over labor power. So South Africa and its affair with globalization. So there's a non-racial government in 1994. In 1996, South Africa adopts orthodox economic reform programs, aka neoliberal policies. So SA triggered globalization internally through state and the country's major conglomerates such as Anglo. There's then government economic policy is GEAR, growth, employment and redistribution in 1996. So clear examples of this happening in South Africa, the Ministry of Public Enterprise in 1987 restructured state-owned corporations. For example, Cecil was privatized, um, corporatized Transnet, emerging from the old Department of Railways, Telkom from the old Department of Post and Telecommunications, and so on. So, and the deregulation of the financial sector. So South Africa's double transition, neoliberalism and democracy. So democracy was birthed from frustrated political unrest. It opened the door to negotiations. So we see optimism from the unions, the same model seen in the rest of Africa by being used in South Africa, state alliance with the unions, and a path to build a new national economy and a new elite state-regulated capitalism of the old times. So at first, they proposed the RDP, Reconstruction and Development Program, but that was quickly scraped for a different economic system, a phase of capitalism, and that is how we got GEAR. So if you read Lehulere 1996 paper, he argues that GEAR was not the start of the ANC move into neoliberalism, but the consolidation into one document of a series of drifts that had already taken place. So the general policies of GEAR include fiscal austerity, limited spending and restructuring of state assets, financial liberalization, no more protection, free flow of money for foreign investment and different tax models, labor flexibility, variable applications of employment standards, productivity enhancement, wage moderation, and a social pact to freeze wages and prices and improve delivery and investment. So economic and racial redress is still central. Privatization post 1994 explicitly states that it should be used to create a black capitalist class. Okay, so problems with neoliberalism. So neoliberalism was unstable. It was filled with boom and bust, stock market crashes. It's not effective. Wages stagnated, growth rates still low. In fact, unemployment skyrocketed. There's restoring power of a global elite, capitalist growth that is occurring, a greater share pocketed by the elite. There's a redistribution of power and money upwards. So, in our Vice Chancellor's book, A Paradox of Victory, COSATU, and the Democratic Transformation in South Africa, he spoke about economic crisis of the 1980s and 1990s and how it undermined careful pact between unions and government to build this new national economy and exposes the authoritarianism of many post-independent African states. Um, so a new wave of democratic protests, the new wave of democratic protests in the 1990s. So a new wave of democratic protests in the 1980s in South Africa took over. So I guess a big South African lesson was that with democracy comes neoliberalism, which negates and undermines democracy with the exclusion of the majority from the economy. So in 2003, we are still under gear as policy, yet we have a huge unemployment crisis, work insecurity and informalization, casualization and outsourcing, and labor brokers and low wages. Thank you for listening to all three lectures. I hope you enjoyed them and all the best with your test.